Welcome back for another episode of our special series called The Lunch, where I share a little bit more behind the scenes on how it's going with Francesco and I officially starting our own ceramics business, Cara Terra. But real quick, before we dive into this episode, I have a rather timely announcement. So if you are listening along to the podcast in quote unquote real time as this episode airs, you might just want to pay particular attention. Because right now, when this airs, it is technically Friday, September 8th, 2023. I have just reopened the doors to my iconic 6-week photography course, the Makers Photography Styling System. I bring this up right now at the start of this episode because the doors will only be open for one more week, or until we hit max capacity, whichever one happens first. So by the time you're listening to the next episode of this podcast, we'll have closed the doors to new students because the course begins on September 18th. All these dates sound like they should be really far away, but as it turns out, September is here and the 18th is only actually 10 days away. Now, you're about to hear just how crazy these next few weeks are for us and all things Cara Terra. So you're probably going to start thinking, why in the world did you decide to start the course again now? So just let me explain right up front. I wanted to make sure that we provided the option for the Makers Photography Styling System now because it means getting this information into your brains before the onset of the true holiday craziness. It's kind of like back to school, but for grown-ups. I wanted to make sure that this year could be the year where your online listings don't actually take you hours just to take the photos for. You know, maybe this year could be the year you actually sleep in October or November or December. That's my dream, at least. And I did not intend that pun, and I didn't even realize I had that pun until now that I've said it out loud, but it totally works. Anyway, the thing is, I know that it is possible to have better photos in less time. Not only from my own personal experience, but because I have heard directly from some of the past 200 students we've had inside of the Makers Photography Styling System over the last few years. They've told me just how much easier photography is for them now because of the system they learned inside of the course. In fact, recently, just this past week, course alum Anne, who is Ceramics by Anne on Instagram that you should totally go check out, she literally now takes her photos on her lunch break during work. And one of those very photos she took of her gorgeous double-walled vessels is now featured in a half-page print in a national magazine in Ireland. I'm so stinking excited for her. It's amazing. Go follow her at Ceramics by Anne on Instagram and see the photos. And now I'm kind of rambling from excitement. So, all this to say, if finally figuring out a way to take better photos faster was on your 2023 New Year's resolution list that probably feels like a lifetime ago, it's not too late. You can still make it happen this year, and I have a step-by-step system to make that a reality for you. Learn more at makersplaybook.com/MPSS. Now, like I said, this is just one of many things happening in the next few weeks, so let's dig into the reality of what it's really like to make a living from the things Francesco and I make right after a brief word from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Cammie, the purchasing manager at Amico, providing you with everything you need for clay. This episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze or Brent equipment at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Now, on with the show. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 13 years, Rebecca Ikes Cara. Ironically, when I first was thinking about this launch series and loosely planning when I might share these episodes, I thought that this episode would be called The Calm Before the Storm. The storm being the fact that we have 5 markets in the next 5 weeks. Yes, you heard that correctly. We're crazy enough to take on a market every single weekend of basically September through part of October. And 3 of those, in fact, the 3 right in the middle, are 2-day shows. But the reason I'm laughing now at the idea that this would be the calm before the market storm is because anyone who's ever prepared for a show before knows that the days and weeks leading up to a show are anything but calm. In fact, sitting in the booth is probably the calm part. So let's just go ahead and add to this the fact that September is also my busiest month for the photography business. I have 3 weekends in a row of major events. A wedding last weekend, a 2-day wedding starting tonight, literally, and going through 12 hours of photography coverage tomorrow, and then a gala next weekend. Yes, I will somehow be magically transforming myself from sweaty art festival booth setter-upper into a black tie formal event photographer next Saturday, all in one day. If anybody has a fairy godmother to spare and maybe some mice that could change a pumpkin into a carriage, I would much appreciate it. Are we crazy? Probably. Yeah. Okay, definitely fine. But this is also sometimes just the reality of transition. It's messy, and I have always promised to be here giving you the realistic look into it all. And while we are, yes, totally pursuing the dream life that we really, really want, sometimes it's not so dreamy in the climb to get there. Sometimes all the opportunities just come at once. Or, more realistically, sometimes you're too nervous to give up your old ways entirely before diving into the new, unknown territory. In other words, that's me. I was too nervous to give up events completely, and so instead of quitting one job before starting another, I'm sitting in the space where I basically have 4 jobs. Yes, 4. Let's not dwell on that, though, shall we? I'm working on changing that because, as I said at the beginning, sleep is important. Remember my first statement about why I reopened the doors right now in all this craziness to the Maker's Photography styling system? Amidst all of this, I want sleep for you, my friends. If I didn't have a fast and efficient system for taking photos of our work that I then barely even have to edit, there's no way I would be managing these 4 different jobs. But anyway, you can go learn more about that at makersplaybook.com/MPSS, right? So, the point of all this is to say that change can be scary, even for those of us used to the wild ride of self-employment. And sometimes you have to baby step your way out of your comfort zone. And that's okay. But I do hope that you keep taking those baby steps, just one little step at a time. Within the baby steps we've been taking for Cara Terra, I've been thinking about some of the unfair advantages we have in getting this business off the ground. But here's the thing. I am confident that you also have unfair advantages to bring to the table for getting your own small business going. Maybe it's something as obvious as having a network of friends that own their own stores and would gladly carry and promote your work. Maybe it's even a friend or a relative with a massive social media presence who can shout out your own account. Or maybe it's a little bit less obvious, like the culmination of your life experiences up until this point and how that influences your specific aesthetic. Now, the first one might sound more important, and I'm using air quotes here, but I'd like to take a moment to argue against that. One thing that is true of any art form, of any medium, any material you work in across the board is the necessity of having something unique to say. A unique aesthetic style, a unique perspective or concept that you're bringing across through the way you choose to make the work, whatever it might be. I don't think there are too many people whose work hangs in galleries because they copied someone else. Now, cultural appropriation notwithstanding, different conversation for a different time and a much deeper dive down art history. So definitely do that, but I think you get what I'm trying to say here. So, as I start to give examples of a variety of unfair advantages in this episode, I want you to remember that none of them are better than others. You have an unfair advantage, I'm sure of it. We just have to attempt to stop comparing ourselves to others for a little bit in order to figure out what it is. I know, easier said than done. So what the heck is an unfair advantage, and how does it connect to my sharing about Francesco and I's experiences currently launching Cara-Terra? Well, in our specific case, we obviously have the big unfair advantage of the fact that Francesco had nearly a decade in production pottery already before we ever even started this business. Making the work in a reasonable amount of time is clearly not a problem. If I was doing this all on my own, my friends, let me tell you, there is no way I would have enough inventory for 3 back-to-back 2-day shows, let alone 5. And then there's the fact that I've started a business before. So with that experience, I had the advantage of being able to set some priorities. I knew that I could put together a landing page for a website without needing to finish the entire website. That's exactly what we did when we were applying to all of these shows and I didn't have the full site finished. I still don't consider the full site finished. It's never really finished. Websites are growing, organic, moving things, but that's a different conversation. I also knew from my unfair advantage of past experience that the faster we could have people remembering and sharing our name, Cara-Terra, the better. I knew from my experience with photography that the business can begin to grow itself the more people start to see your name associated with places or people they already trust. For example, in the wedding industry, this has come incredibly gradually by building up relationships with other vendors and professionals, as well as an online presence that connects my work with specific venues and locations that are popular for people to get married. Let me give you a more specific example to make that make sense. When someone goes and books the Chicago Cultural Center, for example, to have their wedding, and then they Google Chicago Cultural Center wedding, they see my photos come up. They probably don't remember my name from that one search, but then when they meet with the team at the Cultural Center and see our name on the list of preferred photographers, and then visit our website again, they might start to think, oh yeah, I kind of remember this. And then when they hire a wedding planner and my name is also recommended, or when they ask one of their friends who they hired to do the photography for their wedding, and my name is said, now there is a ton of trust already built up, and I haven't even talked to them yet. But the other catch is when I ask them how they heard about me, they will probably only tell me that very last situation. Their friend referred me, or the planner referred me. So how are we doing this with Cara-Terra? Well, it looked like saying yes to opportunities that we might have said no to otherwise, such as getting up at 5:30 in the morning in order to set up our booth early and be interviewed on the morning news. It's saying yes to paying for a bit of advertising in a local print magazine, specifically at the same time that we're doing all of these shows, so that the people who might be coming to the shows that we're in are reminded of our name even when the show isn't happening. And of course, it's posting regularly on platforms like Instagram so that when people do meet us at a show, Whether they buy something that day or not, they're reminded of us as they scroll along on their phone at night, days, weeks later. Knowing how all of these things work together, for me, is an unfair advantage. Not the least reason of which is because it allows me to detach a bit from the immediate results of something as fickle as Instagram. I'm not necessarily expecting to be able to track direct sales straight from a single Instagram post. I mean, don't get me wrong, that sounds awesome. I will be thrilled if there comes a day when I can see that someone clicked a link that I shared to a product in an Instagram story, came to our online shop, and then bought that product. How amazing would that be? But it doesn't necessarily always work that way. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Instagram isn't working for us. But this was not intended to be yet another episode where we wind up talking all about Instagram. So let's get back on track here with unfair advantages. Frankly, the most obvious unfair advantage I had for selling ceramics, long before I ever even had met Francesco, was my background in photography. I took great photos of really mediocre pots, the pots that I was making 5 or more years ago. And frankly, I was able to sell those pots on Etsy. And let's be clear, I give all credit to those sales to the photos. Let me tell you, it wasn't the lovely shapes that I was making as a newbie potter, and it wasn't a deep understanding of the way Etsy works with its keywords and all of that I've talked about before. Or rather, I've talked about before on the podcast. Like, I know this. It was truly just the fact that the photos stuck out from the crowd. If you've listened to the podcast for a while now, you have heard me cringe at the memory of a set of cereal bowls I made for someone when I first started, and just how much grog was inside of those bowls. Because, of course, I loved the iron speckles. I still do. But now I think about just how miserable it must be to run a spoon over all that grog. Because at the time, I definitely didn't know about burnishing or anything like that. Let's move on from that memory. Because the photos looked great. And this is my segue to say, not all unfair advantages are fixed historical things. Yes, some unfair advantages can't be changed. And clearly, there is plenty of inequity and lack of accessibility to many resources in the arts that create unfair advantages for certain segments of society instead of others. And that's garbage. Where you were born might be an unfair advantage. Where you currently live might be an unfair advantage. The resources you have available to you that allow you to build a home studio or rent a separate space are unfair advantages that maybe just kind of happen to you. But there are also other unfair advantages that we can create. Perhaps it's keeping a regular job that gives you some flexible hours, or you can work from home, where you can have the assurances of knowing your healthcare is taken care of no matter how much pottery you sell. It's definitely an unfair advantage. Maybe it's financial support from a spouse or a loved one. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's the freedom to say yes to an apprenticeship halfway across the world because you aren't tied down to anyone. Literally, the opposites of each other can be unfair advantages depending on what your goals are. We can also learn new skills to create unfair advantages. We can even take something that seems like a disadvantage and make it into an unfair advantage of our unique style. Most people would think that in order to throw on the wheel, you have to keep your hands absolutely perfectly still. But I've studied directly under the wonderful, lovely Sandy Lockwood, known for the movement and flow of her pieces. And now she uses an essential tremor that developed in her hands a few years ago to her advantage for her unique style. Now, that's a more literal example of something outside of your control and finding the silver lining. But there are also heaps of other skills that are very learnable that give someone an unfair advantage. especially when it comes to selling your work and making a living from the things that we make. And yes, I'm clearly going to talk about photography here. Because the reality is, there are a lot of makers with unfair advantages of being comfortable with using the internet to their advantage that have been able to grow their platforms leaps and bounds past other makers who might even have more experience in the craft but less experience with something like Instagram. Well, it might sound like a pipe dream for me to say because you've already been spending hours on YouTube trying to figure out how the heck to take photos of pottery. It is possible to learn how to take better photos of your work in less time without spending heaps of money on a bunch of new equipment. And you can create an unfair advantage for yourself. However, it's a lot easier when you have someone teaching you that particular skill specifically for pottery. It's not your fault if you've been watching general photography tutorials online with examples of landscapes and birds and flowers, and then you couldn't figure out how to apply those concepts to photographing your mug, or how to get the color of your glossy glaze on the interior of a bowl to look accurate in the pictures. Photographing a landscape properly is entirely different than photographing a pot. The step-by-step system I built inside of the Maker's Photography Styling System is specifically for photographing ceramics. And it's specifically designed to work regardless of what kind of camera you use. Yes, the whole system works if you only use your cell phone. Now, I don't want this entire episode to become a sales pitch, so if you're interested in learning more, wipe the mud off your hands right now and come visit makersplaybook.com/MPSS. The 4 letters. M as in makers, P as in photography, S as in styling, S as in system. Because as I said at the very beginning, the doors are only going to be open until next Friday, the 15th, or until we reach maximum capacity, whichever one comes first. And in full transparency, the last 2 times we hosted this course, we were 1 person shy away of maximum. So we just might hit it this time before Friday. We'll see. This might be especially true. I mention all of this because there is one more important thing you should know before I stop talking about this course. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while or following me online, then you know that historically I offer this course again in January. But I can't do that next year. This is the last time I will be offering the Maker's Photography Styling System for the foreseeable future. Yes, it will happen again eventually. I just genuinely have no idea of when exactly will be. We have some really big, exciting projects coming up for early 2024, so I already know there is no way I'm going to have enough time to host another cohort of this course as I usually would. All this to say, if you are already overwhelmed with holiday preparations and thinking this all sounds great, but I definitely can't do it until January, you do still have access to the entire course for 6 months after we start here in the next week. So if you want to wait and watch everything in January, now is still the right time to actually join. And also, just in case it's not obvious, all of the lessons are recorded. So while I'm available for direct one-on-one support, you can also watch everything and practice at your own pace, in your own time zone. I can respond to your questions in the comments, in the written form, in each of our own time zones. We have students from all over the world, so nothing is dependent on you needing to join at a specific time every week or anything like that. All right, enough about the logistics of the Maker's Photography Styling System. If you want to know more, just pop on over to makersplaybook.com/MPSS. Or shoot me an email, hello@makers-playbook.com, and we can chat about whatever you want. Whether you want to make photography your own unfair advantage or not, I do hope you take a little bit of time to think about what unfair advantages you already have. Think about the potters and the ceramicists that you admire and how they're using their own unfair advantages to, well, their advantage. Kurt Hammerly had a background in the software and the rendering technology he now uses to create his iconic work. Kenny Singh of Turn Studios studied design, and Sarah Husseini of Not Work Related studied architecture before they ever got into clay so seriously, and you can see the influences of all of their past experiences in their unique aesthetics. Rose B. Simpson, who closed out NCECA this past year, frankly bringing very unexpected tears to my eyes, has a specifically unique life experience growing up with her own mother, Roxanne Swensel, working as an artist. And those life experiences have clearly informed her own unique work now. Even artists who might consider the access that they had to resources to be a limitation, as Virgil Ortiz shared back on episode number 329 when he talked about his first ever visit to a clay supply store as an adult, well, he wound up having an unfair advantage in the way that the resources he didn't have access to produced such a unique work with the resources he did have access to. But also, please remember, unfair advantages do not have to be historical or fixed. I know for myself, especially when I was first getting into photography, that's what my brain thought all the time. I was constantly finding examples of other photographers who just happened to have a college friend getting married at the fanciest hotel in the city, who of course then hired them, or who knew someone that knew someone, etc., etc. What unfair advantages that I didn't have. But my friends, this is the important part of this whole episode. Those were just excuses for me to create, to release myself from responsibility. I had my own advantages, thanks to my own unique set of life experiences, that ultimately allowed me to communicate with my photography clients in a way that no other photographer was doing. It was just easier at the time to blame things on all the outside stuff that I had no control over. The unfair advantages I started this entire episode talking about, Francesco's past experience in learning production pottery, my past experience in building a business, neither of those were fixed unfair advantages. Those were things that we learned, and frankly only learned in our adult life. They aren't anything that we were innately born with. So what if the thing that you've been thinking slowed you down from this clay journey is the very thing that gives you a unique perspective on how you create your work? What if all that experience you had in another career or job are the very experiences that can help you uniquely move forward in this dream? What might your unfair advantage be? And how can you use it to your advantage? And just in case, as you're looking around the internet and comparing to other people's unfair advantages, because I know we all do it, what if the unfair advantages you think other people have are just learnable skills? I don't really have a good way to finish and wrap up this episode and tie everything all in a bow because, to be honest, since I started this episode sharing how crazy these few weeks are, I'm recording this on the morning that it's going live, on September 8th, instead of ahead of time, like I normally do, and I am more prepared. So, take it for what it's worth. If learning photography might be helpful for you, right now is the time. Our doors to the Makers Photography Styling System are open. I would love to see you in there because I get so darn excited at seeing the aha moments coming from other makers, and at least in this one aspect of life, making things easier. But nonetheless, regardless of any of that, I hope you take a little bit of time to find your unfair advantage and start showing the world what makes you uniquely you. Once again, this episode was possible in part thanks to our sponsor, AMCO.
Hi, I'm Cammie, the purchasing manager at Amoco, providing you with everything you need for clay. This episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Find your favorite Amoco glaze or Brent equipment at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotzvan, with promotional material assistance from Queenie Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this.